want you to know, I seriously mean this when I say it. Welcome to the Secret Restaurant Podcast. My name is Nate Hoyle. Got a plan for today. Let me tell you it, and then let me tell you some other things. Because I've talked about film adaptations of books in the past. I've talked about books that have been adapted into films. And I've also talked about films that have been adapted into books. And so my question that I'm going to be discussing is like when you read and watch both. When you decide to read the book and watch the film adaptation, why would you do that? Unless it's like the movie came out second. I'm going to talk about that. But I do have some initial thoughts before that. So remind me later to get into that. Been working on the old novel again. You know, it's funny because I've talked about this book in the past. I don't know. I'm not going to keep it a secret what it is because that seems pointless. But I'm writing like this baseball novel. Or it's more like a sports novel. That's a horror novel. And to summarize, it's sort of about a sports equipment company called Trophy Co. or Trophy Company that is practicing sinister things within their technologies and their factory designs and whatnot. Reread through what I have this morning, and it's interesting because, I mean, I've been working on this book for a long time, not all the time, but just, it's always been in my mind. I had a first draft I wrote literally in undergrad, and then it sat in a folder for probably 8 or 9 years, 7 or 8 years maybe, and then finally decided to dedicate to expanding upon it. But since I reread it today, it's interesting watching baseball while reading it, because I feel like my editor's mind was a little bit different, actually having baseball fresh in the background, fresh on my daily life, because I began to catch little mistakes. For example, one of the games, the home team, I accidentally had them playing or batting in the top of the inning, which seems like you should know that, but sometimes when you write, you're just writing, you know. And then I was like, oh, they're supposed to be batting in the bottom of the inning. And then I had to make adjustments around it. I'm not going to get too much into the story, but I was thinking again about my theme of yesterday and social media in particular with readership, because I think it's challenging to write novels when you don't have an audience. And I think that's been something that's really been prolonging my process too. For poetry, I was lucky enough to have my publications happen sooner, and then I had the internet, and I had my cohort at grad school and people reading my poems. It happened a lot faster. And so then it was like I could write poems easier because I was already thinking and speaking to an audience, whether or not, like, I'm not thinking about one person when I'm writing a poem, but there's still the pressures, so to speak, but also the influence and persuasion of knowing that someone's actually going to read this. And as I mentioned, I've ghostwritten novels, and so that one I also had a reader. Like, I had my client first and foremost, and then I also had my editor, and then I also knew that there would be a broader people reading it because it was going to happen. It was like this book, despite me not knowing what the title is going to be or where it goes or blah, 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 there was still going to be the romance audience reading it. But with this novel, I feel like I'm just kind of struggling to get the wheels turning because I don't have like a fiction audience in my mind or in the real world, really. So I think it's been a struggle. But I have a solid 15,000 words, and I'm like really proud of it. And I need to just like buckle down and get the thing rolling because it's been way too long of me just like sitting around thinking about it. This has been a self-indulgent 5 minutes, but yeah, I don't know. I think I went through something with poetry where I was kind of aiming too high at first with my publications, and then I had to kind of, like, I was trying to get into publications that you would see in like Barnes and Noble. And then I began to discover more online magazines and more magazines that take bigger risks with what they publish, because if you see a magazine on a newsstand, chances are they're not going to be taking risks with who they publish. They're going to be publishing people for their CV, and also because it fits into a sort of mold, unless you already have a name for yourself, that would be the CV. But I feel like with fiction, because I do send out short stories, and I think I've only had maybe 4 published. Maybe I'm just like 5 years behind my poetry, or it's like I need to start researching more journals that are like more experimental and take risks. And I need to improve too. I need to become better at writing fiction, because poetry, sometimes it feels like I already put those 10,000 hours in. And with fiction, it's not quite there yet. But let's go back to the initial prompt theme. Movie adaptations of novels. Novel adaptations of movies, which are more rare. So I think last week, or whatever, earlier this week, I was talking about Stephen King being an influence on me and an inspiration on me. And I think that I just proved that point even further today, because yesterday I went to my favorite theater, the Last Picture House in downtown Davenport, and I saw his adaptation, or the adaptation of his lesser known, formerly pen name published, The Long Walk. And then that's probably honestly why I got all excited to look at my novel again. Because for some reason, Stephen King's career and his writing makes me want to write too for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe just his prolific nature, the fact that he writes in a way that I feel like I could write too, and just how his career exploded to a level that no other writer has ever experienced, I don't think, as far as like movies and success and all that go. So yeah, The Long Walk. I've known about this novel for quite some time. It's interesting. I did read it maybe 3 years ago or so. There was a phase 3 years ago where I went through a bunch of his Bachman books, which if people don't know, you probably do, but if you don't, he had a pen name in the beginning of his career. So he was publishing Stephen King books, but he was just so prolific that he had more novels than he could publish under his own brand or name or whatever, especially early on, because publishers didn't want to saturate the market or take the risk of publishing too much Stephen King. And so he had a pen name called Richard Bachman that also he began to publish, I think, just about a novel a year under the Bachman name. And then eventually someone found out it was him, and it was all foiled. But the Bachman books have become just as famous and just as notorious as the Stephen King books. And I think I read by the end of the Bachman legacy, before he kind of got revealed that it was also Stephen King, I think the last book he published under the Bachman name, which was called Thinner, about a guy who can't stop losing weight until he becomes a weak skeleton. That book, I guess, was selling better than whatever book Stephen King put out under his own name that year. And that kind of stuff is just interesting to me. I'm sorry if I've said this on the podcast before, because I don't know. So I think just like little things like that in a career inspire me, and they make me think about my own what things I could do. Not necessarily pen names, but just like being prolific or being creative in what you do to get your art out and stuff like that. But anyway, this Long Walk book, I had kind of just so feelings about it. I'm glad I read it, and I did understand its mystique and its sort of draw that people had towards it. But I also thought writing-wise, it was far from the best Stephen King book I read, which basically, one of the reasons I'm scrutinizing it so much is because a lot of people I've talked to, actually, it's one of their favorites that he's written. And I think it kind of boils down to that a lot of people read it when they were in high school, because the prose of this Long Walk book is pretty simple. It does kind of read like a YA book. And I think that's understandable because I believe he did write it when he was actually an undergrad. So the premise of the book is basically it's kind of a dystopian future. And interestingly enough, a lot of the Bachman books kind of deal with dystopian game shows or dystopian organized violence. Because he has another book called The Running Man that also deals with dystopian games. It's about a dystopian game show, which they're making a second remake of. Oh, I wanted to say, I might be wrong about this as far as the adaptations go, but I believe this was the first film adaptation of The Long Walk ever made. Maybe I missed something, but that's actually pretty rare for Stephen King's catalog. Is that, I mean, there's film adaptations and TV adaptations of just about everything he's ever done, from short stories to novels and all of that. And then not only that, there's usually multiples. There's multiple Shinings, multiple It's, multiple The Stands. But I believe this was the very first Long Walk adaptation, which it was published in the 70s, and now it's over 50 years later. Or no, I think it's probably 46 or 47 years later, finally they're doing the adaptation on film. So it's interesting to think it took so long. But anyway, dystopian future, and it's basically like there's sort of a lottery where everyone signs up for this long walk. And then basically what it is, it's a competition where people just keep walking. And if they go below 3 miles an hour on their walk, they are killed. And then it's finally, they thin out until just one person wins. One of my issues with it, even reading it, maybe they do a better job in the movie, but I felt like it didn't make sense why anyone would sign up for the challenge. Like knowing that you're probably just going to die. And then secondly, throughout the movie, because it starts off with like 50 dudes, and then they're all kind of like becoming friends and stuff. There's some bickering and whatnot. But they all kind of build a camaraderie amongst each other, knowing that only one of them is going to survive. But that being said, when I watched this film, and I think they were kind of pushing it rather obviously, but I think it was kind of a metaphor for like a military draft, probably like the Vietnam War draft. Because there's like a few instances where they're talking about everybody signs up for this lottery to win money. And then secondly, and then like they got chosen out of the lottery. And then secondly, they were wearing these numbers that looked like dog tags. And like, yeah, just stylistically, I felt like it was kind of being suggestive of military. I mean, they were being followed by tanks and stuff and soldiers when they were doing this walk. And the soldiers were the people who would shoot people if they slowed from 3 miles an hour for too long or too many times or whatever. So in that regard, if it's a metaphor, I'm willing to accept it more. But I think I just had questions about it when I was reading the book too, of like why would anyone sign up for this? And then also, why would you be friends with people if they were basically either going to die or get you killed? Like, there wasn't really as much of the competitiveness to it. It was more just like everybody was in it together, which is an interesting concept. And maybe my interpretation is too cynical, but I had those questions when I was reading it. And then when I was watching it, I already kind of knew what I was getting into. So that question wasn't there as much, but it's still a question that's worth being asked. So, to my initial prompt, film adaptation and book adaptation. This is a book I read first, and then I watched the movie. It's one of many Stephen King books, but it's one of the few that I probably read the book before watching the movie. I think there weren't too many that I can think of that it's like that. For example, Shining I saw first, Pet Sematary I saw first, Cujo I saw first. I think The Dead Zone I read first. Christine I read first. Christine is a great underrated Stephen King novel. That's that's one of my favorites. And it's a little bit, even the plot itself, it's about like a killer car. It's a little bit pulpy, it's a little bit over the top, so it's probably not for everyone, but I just love that one. I think The Shining is probably his best book. Pet Sematary was awesome. He definitely has like some highs and lows though. But anyway, the question is, why would you watch a movie after reading a book for this one? And then I'll flip it around later. But I think for this, partially it is my interest in Stephen King too, of why I would want to watch the movie. And also this long walk was in theaters, and so then it was like something to do. But I've done it not in theaters too. Like I read Firestarter first, and then I watched the 80s one. I think I even read Carrie before seeing the original Carrie, which is one of those classics that your film fanatics love that one. But what's the point of that? Why would you go see a movie after you've already read the book? Because, people always say the book is better than the movie. Maybe it's more an inclination to see how did they do it? How did they pull it off? Did they capture the certain things that I had in my mind? Or maybe for this long walk one, it had been 3 years since I read it. And although the plot pretty much was done to a T in the way the book was, it's almost a reminder sometimes maybe. Like you remind yourself about the story, and your nostalgia makes you interested in watching it when you don't want to have to go through the 4, 5, 6, 7 hours of reading a novel. But other than research and nostalgia, since everybody is saying the book is better than the movie, all the readers say that, which isn't always true. What other reasons could there possibly be to go watch a movie that you've already read the book, unless you are absolutely in love with the book? Here's a similar question for people who don't read. I guess you could almost have the similar parallel argument about remakes of films. Like going to see the remake after already seeing the first one. People who read, is that the same question? I don't know. Anyway, in the comments, why don't you let me know, if you read a book first, why you would be interested in seeing the adaptation. And then we can move on to our even weirder question. So if you've already seen the movie, why would you go back and read the book? Who knows? Let's find out. It was something interesting that happened, I think, for my generation specifically, for people around my age, is the Harry Potter phenomenon. I think that a lot of people found out about Harry Potter and started enjoying the Harry Potter movies after all the books were already out. And in my own instance, I'm 32. I was born in 1992. The last Harry Potter movie came out when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school when the last one came out, or maybe it was that summer afterwards. But, so therefore, the story of the novels, I think my first time remembering Harry Potter as a novel, I was like a little kid. And then the novels were coming out, and then the films were coming out over the span of 12 years or whatever it was. Maybe a little bit less than that. But so then we were reading the books and watching the movies at the same time because they were being released in the same time. But there's a surprising amount of people who are Harry Potter fans, quote unquote, who have never read the books. I think that's probably a timing thing where because my generation, tons of people were reading the books. And it was, maybe there was a shift where once all the movies were out, people just watched the movies. I've seen all the Lord of the Rings movies, and I have never read through an entire Lord of the Rings book. I've perused them to see what they're like, and I read The Hobbit. But I'm pretty familiar with Lord of the Rings, and I've only seen the movies, so I guess I can't be too critical in that regard. But I think Harry Potter in my lifetime would be the best example of would people benefit from going back and reading the books. But I don't feel like talking about Harry Potter, though, because it's not on my mind, the plot or anything. But that's just an example of how the way things are released and where you are in your life when they are released might affect my question of reading slash viewing slash order of it. All right, so let's ask the other question. If you've already seen the movie, why would you go and read the book? And I would like to keep it initially as like the book was published first, but the same question could be talking about novelizations that came out after the movie was released too. Star Wars would be the ultimate example, because Star Wars, all those films came out, or at least the first one, and then afterwards, these sort of universes of novelizations and comic books and video games, that came out after the first Star Wars, which was A New Hope. So that of the fandom would be one example. And I think for that one, especially since the people writing these books are fans themselves, that would be probably more a curiosity of expansions of the universe, expansions of the storylines, expansions of the characters' lives. And for so long, people felt like there needed to be more Star Wars films, but there weren't. Like, there were the first 3, and then the next 3 came out, and then it was a long time before any more came out. All right, so that's one reason. Curiosity towards more details, more expansion, more timelines of the world at hand. So what other reasons? So maybe I'll think about another Stephen King I read first. Oh no, I was watching, I talked about this book already. So the movie was called American Fiction, and then the novel is called Erasure by Percival Everett. And I felt inclined after watching American Fiction maybe 7 or 8 months later to go find the book. And firstly, the reason that I went and found the book, I would say the primary reason, was because I had read another book by the same author, the book James. And then I wanted to read more by Percival Everett. Just so happened the one at the store I found was Erasure. But what other reasons would I have for wanting to read that book? I guess that one, it would be seeing the craft of it, or being a fan of literature, and seeing, reversely, how a filmmaker might tell a story on a book that's based on a book. Reversely, how might a book be told in a story that you already saw the movie? So then it's the reverse of it. I would say with this example, it's mostly just wanting to read more of the author. And probably with Stephen King, it's the same thing too. So maybe it comes down to a respect for the author and wanting to study their craft and wanting to see how they tell a story. And that's kind of where my mind is at. But I will say, with this Erasure book based on American Fiction, there are a lot of pretty striking differences. And it's almost like the novel goes places and is more transgressive and is more risk-taking than the movie was, which is a cool thing to see. Wow, that's a great point, Nate. No, I think that's inevitable. It's like literature. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about banned books, and books can still be controversial and have pushback, but one of the cool things about books is that they can actually go places that films can't, or popular films can't, I think. Like, I think inherently, if there's a transgressive book, i.e., I don't know, Fight Club based on a novel, trying to think of other ones that I actually read, but usually when there's a transgressive novel, American Psycho for sure, the novel goes way deeper into the messed up natures of the characters and the things they're talking about. And then the film usually doesn't quite go as deep into the turmoil. That's a generalization, but films have to go through probably a lot more loopholes than just like a book. And it's easier to watch films, and more people who will be upset watch films too. I'm still plugging through. Sorry for talking about so many different titles and authors, but I feel like I have to give a reference for everything I talk about, just so that it seems like I know somewhat just slightly what I'm talking about, just somewhat barely know what I'm talking. Still plugging through that novel by Don DeLillo called Libra. Took a really long break from it, to be honest, but it's a monster. And one of the interviews, Don DeLillo was talking about how reading is a form of sharing secrets, which I think I just watched the interview and was just like, okay, but it really stuck with me thinking about it. Because like a film or a recording, you can just put it on, you hear it, you absorb it, and that's it. You can form an opinion on it. But with reading, specifically this concept of reading and writing as a form of secrets, people can summarize why books are problematic, or they can put labels on why books are problematic. But to really be outraged, rightfully outraged, or understand the depths and problems and anything else about a book, really, you have to actually sit down and put in the time to read it. And reading, not really audiobooks, not listening, but reading is silent, and reading, it happens by yourself, and you interpret something. And books have always been banned. Books have always been criticized. Books have always been put on display as good or bad or evil or heavenly or whatever. But really, there's kind of a disconnect from what films do and what music does and all that stuff, where in reality, to understand a book, you do it by yourself. You sit down and you do it in silence. And that's kind of how there's secrets within them. And so what I'm talking about really is why transgressive books seem to slide under the radar more. And then when someone tries to make an adaptation in a film, some of the things that happen in the book might be shut down or might be deemed, you can't do that. People might say, you can't do that. All right, team, that's all I got for today. I feel like that's a good note to end on. You know what? I think I'm going to turn my podcast into a written podcast. Wonder if anyone's ever done that before. It wouldn't be a podcast then. The new written podcast, it'll be my big break, where I talk into my phone and then transcribe it, and then you have to read it. What am I talking about? I don't know. All right. I do have another throwback episode. I accidentally did them out of order, so I'm jumping back 1 month from the last time. But this one is in January of this year. So it was January 13th, 2025. And I went and saw Zach Sabbath. You can hear me talk about it in a much shittier way than I talk about things now. I'll talk to you guys later.